Yeah, so I needed to find the code data, practicals data. Sorry. Why can't I? Practicals data. Here we are. Okay, so read CSV. Import pandas, SVP. Read CSV. And this is the data frame that we should be what is this error? I'm sorry. Anyone at this error? I actually. Well, in principle, you could have just used this function. I don't know why I'm getting this funny error that I don't want to waste all of you guys' times fixing it now. So I will just export it as a CSV from Excel. But in principle, you should be able to read Excel files as well. Okay. So now this is just a CSV. Oh, maybe I was just reading. Yeah, exactly. I was reading Excel file with a read CSV function. Okay, that was it. So we just assign it to data frame, and now data frame is this thing. And yeah, to avoid having that first unnamed column that comes from the fact that the first column of the file is actually the indexes, we have the index call exactly in the CSV file reader, where we can specify that the first column is actually the index. So if we now have a look at the file, we don't have the unnamed column anymore. Okay. And yeah, then basically this data frame was giving us a set of features that we wanted to create our image from. So for each one of those, we want to create a figure that has a shape in it of some color, of some size, and of a given position. And we want to do this using PIL, which is this library that we were seeing for reading and writing images. And yeah, the basic command for creating a new image is this image new. Like the basic interaction, like interface for the PIL library is the image object, like class from which we create image objects. So we first import the image class, and then we can create a new object with this syntax. We want the mode RGB because we want to specify like colors using the RGB channel specification, as we discussed last time. We want to pass the size argument to give a different size to the image, and we can, if we want, we won't be like in this case there is no such specification, but we could also put a background color by specifying the color attribute. So I will just use this code, and we want an image of size 300, 400. We say image equal to, and as we saw last time with PIL, we can just put the image variable as the last element of the cell, and this will automatically display it. If I close all the brackets, it will automatically display it. And yeah, the default color for the background is actually black, and we'll leave it this way for now. Yeah, so we want to try to generate an image that has as shape. Let's assign a shape variable to triangle. Yeah, as I was saying last time, when I have to create things in a loop, I would generally, like, this is why I was splitting the exercise in steps. So let's first assume that, like, let's imagine that we are iterating over the data frame. And so let's assign all the variables that we want to use. The shape will be triangle. The color will be blue. The size will be 100, and the horizontal position will be 150. Okay. So now we need to add the we need to draw the triangle, and so we saw that for drawing things on images we have to create a drawer object, which we also need to import from PIL, to which we pass the image object that we want to print on, that we want to write on. Image draw, sorry. This is not a library that I know by heart. And I guess is also .new. Oh, image draw. Okay, so now the drawer is basically a drawer object that has a bunch of methods that I can use to generate shapes like rectangles, circles, whatever, over the image. And I think it has a polygon for the triangle. So circle would be just a method, square as well, but for triangle we have to create a polygon with three elements, which is a triangle. So we have to specify now this as a list of coordinates we want to generate the triangle on. So our position is horizontal position, and the size, so I guess let's say the side is 100, and we can fix the vertical position to be let's say that is always half, so 200. So I am just now writing the coordinates of all the vertices that we want for this triangle. So one element, another element. Okay, I don't remember trigonometry now, so I will just say that the vertex is something like this over 2. And let's see what I get. I mean, kind of. Let's say that we stick with this triangle. You could have done a better job for your exercise, but doesn't really matter. Now, the only annoying thing is let's try to change horizontal position, because maybe this is actually vertical position. Sorry, my computer is super slow for some reason. Okay, so we actually want to well, let's not waste too much time over figure out the coordinates for the polygon. Let's just say that, yeah, you could have adjusted better the coordinates to put it where you actually wanted. And now the point was to organize the code above in a function where we can, for example, pass all those variables that we are defining. Draw shape. We can pass all those parameters. yeah, we are actually also are not really specifying a color at the moment. Let's say if shape equal triangle, we have this. Otherwise, the other option was we have square. So let's say if shape equal triangle to this, leaf shape equal to square. Actually want to pass the color to be so for colors we could have defined a dictionary, for example, because we need to convert the string of the color to an RGB triplet. So we could have say something like dict, and if color is blue, this corresponds to 0, 0 to RGB, so 0, 0, 255. If the color was red, this would have been 255, 0, 0. And we can just say that the color equal to color dict color. And if the shape is a square, we can actually say instead of drawer polygon, we can just say drawer square. And here we pass 4 coordinates that are the positions of the like the coordinates of the bottom part of the shape and the height and width. So I'm just now copying it from the notebook. We can just say fill to specify the color. Okay. Vertical position, horizontal position, size. Let's say square image drawer. Oh, this is actually okay, something like that. So now this code we can actually put, we can try to change these two. Okay, so I'm changing the vertical position instead of the horizontal, so I have to switch those two coordinates. As I mentioned the other time, working with images can be super annoying in terms of X and Y's. Okay, so now this is better. Good, so this is actually the code that I want to put in my draw shape function. And yeah, what we want to do at the end of the function is to actually save this image, which I think we can just do with image.save, and we can specify a file name. Image save, and we can pass the file name to the function. So let's say we call draw shape, and we save this in users. This should have now saved the blue, well, this was with the default argument, so it was a blue triangle at a given position. Okay, so this was something like for saving the image. And then, I mean, I will leave this exercise, otherwise we spend all the lecture here, but like in the last part, we just had to iterate over the data frame, pass all the elements of the data frame to this function, and save all the images in a folder that we create. Okay, yeah, sorry if this was rushed, but I want to start with the next lecture, which is probably useful to more people, which will be on Git and GitHub. So yeah, Git and GitHub, that are the basic versions of, like, the basic tools for keeping your code clean and store it and potentially share it with other people and publish it. So how many people have already used GitHub in their life? Git or GitHub? Okay. How many people know what it is? Okay, so most people have at least an idea. Good. So yeah, let's start from Git. Git is a so-called software for code versioning, where code versioning is basically what you want to do to avoid to having script folders that look like something like this. So whenever we are working with code, there is no reason of saving in the same place multiple copies of the same, like multiple versions of the same code, because since the code files that we write are just TXT files, they are like super cheap in terms of space that they keep on the computer. And so what people came out with is a so-called version control system, where basically we save the same, we override. It was like overriding the same files over and over again many times. But then every time we save the file, even if we are just seeing the last version on our computer, there is the version control system, which is like what this tool, that we will see now, is basically storing in a hidden folder all the previous versions that we have been saving. So we can just see one single script, just final, we always see just final script, but then we have basically an history that keeps track of all the previous changes. And I mean, nowadays people may be used to systems like that, like now GitHub, Google Docs implements it, some tools for LaTeX Online implements it. Like, we are quite accustomed to this idea of like history of our file. So we can always go back to some days of logs of the changes that we made. Basically, code versioning tools are tools that do it for us over whole folders and not just single files. Okay, so they are a way of keeping track of all the changes that we have been doing to a coding project. So the central idea of version control is the repository, and I already used this word many times to talk, for example, about the place where you were finding all the material for the course, because all the materials I was always writing it in a repository, and the repository is basically the folder. Like, think of it as the folder that usually corresponds to one project that you are keeping track of with version control, that contains all the code that you want to keep track with version control. Okay. And I mean, I will just mention those things in Word now, but then we will go and together try to set one up to actually do it, and by doing understand it more. But for now, let's just start talking about commits. So when we work in a repository, like, we do a bunch of, like, it's not constantly saving. We do a bunch of changes, we add files, we remove some code, we add some other functions, we clean up a notebook, and every now and then, as often as we would save a file, we commit it, which in version control lingo is basically saying saving it. So we commit it, and every time we commit, we are making a snapshot of the repository that if needed, we can go back to. Okay, so I work a bit, and usually commits are free. So like there's like, it's not, the very cool thing of version control is it is not making a entire copy of all your folder. So if you add 4 lines of code and you commit, this will not duplicate all the code that you have in a new version. This will just incrementally keep track of the lines that got changed. So you can literally do 1 commit every 10 lines that you write, and that's perfectly fine because you don't have to worry about the fact that you are duplicating files, because you're not really creating new files. You're just creating efficient snapshots of those files that you can go back to if you want. So commits are free. And this system that I just described is a system that works entirely, like the basics of it work entirely just on your computer. So there is literally a folder that is an hidden folder that you see only if you have like hidden folder, like that you have this option on your file system to see hidden folders of your system or not. If you set it up, and I actually recommend, if people for coding, I generally recommend to always also see the hidden folders of your computer. Sometimes it can be useful. So yeah, there is a hidden folder inside the repository that you're keeping track of, where like that is called .git, and inside this folder you will actually see, like you never go looking into it, but if you want, there are like in that folder there are those efficient representations of all the commits that you made that the version control tool is creating for you. Okay, but this folder is local, so it's not online. It's on your computer, in your repository. If something happened to your machine, you have lost your project. And so this is where GitHub enters in the stage, because GitHub is basically a way of backupping constantly the commits that we make locally using Git, okay, with a local, basically, remote server that allow us to copy the snapshots of our projects also to a remote location where it is safe, and even if our computer breaks or we want to work on another computer, we can always access all the commits, so all the snapshots that we took of our project. Okay, so Git is the basic tool and it works locally. But basically, for practical applications, we will always be, at least I am always using it together with GitHub, which is the online place where I'm making copies of the snapshots using Git. Okay. And so this is what I just say. With GitHub, we basically have an online, let's say, alias of our repository, like a repository that is an identical version of ours that we update like every time we tell Git to do. Git synchronize our the remote snapshots that are in the remote location with all the new snapshots that we took on our computer. And for this, there are those other two words that, I mean, again, we will try to do this, so don't be worried if it's just a lot of term now. But basically, every time we make a bunch of commits, we want to push them. So there is a push command that copy all the commits that we made and put them in the remote repository. And from the push onward, we are safe. We know that even if everything happens to our computer, I was on a plane yesterday, and I left my computer on the plane, and I I was terrified, but I was at least released by the fact that I had committed just before, pushed my code just before leaving, and so I was like, okay, would be very sad, but at least for this CIMeC seminar, I have all my code committed. Okay, so you always want to remember to, just the day before, I was like, okay, I don't really need to push, nothing will happen from, I'm not that I I could lose my computer on a play, whatever, I found it, but I also pushed. Yeah, and the opposite action is, let's assume I would have lost my computer and I would have to start from scratch on my office computer. I have all this bunch of online snapshots, and I now want to start working on them on a new computer. I can pull the snapshots to we'll see, but I can copy the project to a new machine, and I can pull all the changes that have been put online, all the snapshots that are online, to this other place. So this synchronizes all the changes that I had on my lost computer over the new computer. This can also be the case if, not necessarily if you want to change computer, but also you can work on the same project from multiple places, and from each one of those places you can commit the push to GitHub the changes from one place and pull them in another place. Yeah, so this is maybe a bit vague and abstract. So I wanted to now try to, together with you, step by step, create an actual repository, try to make some changes, commit them, etc. There are several ways of interacting with GitHub. So GitHub is GitHub. There is a web browser, so we are all on the same page. But then we will have to do a bunch of stuff on our local computer. And for that bunch of stuff, there is one way of doing things, that is, there is a command line tool that we can use to do all those things. There are also desktop applications like this GitHub desktop that I recommended on downloading. I recommended it just because I know that it's the most common and multi-platform one, but I use one that now is not free anymore. It used to be free when I installed. So I mean, there are different tools. I'm not super familiar with GitHub desktop. We can figure it out together. Probably when you install it, you also have the terminal tools, so you can also try to use the terminal tools. But yeah, let's start from the GitHub part, which is for sure easy and the same for everyone. So if you go to GitHub, every time I have to start a project, I always create the repository on GitHub, and then I copy it on my computer. So the first step that I do is I go on GitHub and I log in. This is the page of GitHub after you have done the login. And after you are there, in the top right corner, you should have a button, a plus button, where you can specify new repository. Okay, so new repository will lead you to a place where we can set up our code. So the first thing that we need is actually a name, obviously. Short names are recommended. Short names that you remember are even better. In this case, we don't have to be particularly fancy. Let's just say CIMeC repo test. Yeah, repository is often shortened in repo. Yeah, this is an example. We can type here a small description, like a few lines description of our repository. So let's say just a test for the course. Okay. And then we have the first important choice, which is whether to make our repository public or private. Because we can imagine whenever we are working on all of our analysis or whatever, we might want to keep them for ourselves or for selected people that we decide to share the code with. Or we can just say, okay, I don't care, I will put everything public. And if you put something public, it means that everyone can go on GitHub and find your code. Okay. GitHub, just for you to be aware of the infrastructure that we use, GitHub is actually owned by a company. They don't do everything for free, which means that if you do a public repository, there's no limits on the things that you will be able to do on it. If you go for a private repository, you might encounter some limitations for things that we actually won't care about in this class. But if you want to go to more advanced functionalities, publish websites from a GitHub page, or implementing testing or deployment, like more advanced features, you might have restrictions if you want to keep your repository private. And this is because obviously who has the biggest interest in keeping repository private are companies that are developing copyrighted code on which they profit, okay? But you guys can safely make a repository private and you will not have any issue with it. Just be aware of the fact that, for example, if you want to show me whatever you're doing, I cannot see it if the repository is private unless you change the settings of the repository to add also me as kind of a authorized person on the repository, okay? It won't really change anything for the sake of this presentation, so I just stick to private. Then we are asked whether we want to initialize the repository with a README file. I would recommend you to do so because we always want a README file in our repository, and we will get to this, but the README file is basically what is displaced when you go on the repository page. Like for the course, the syllabus was the README file of the repository. Okay, so it's whatever is visualized together with the repository, and usually you put there a minimal description of the content of the repository. So even if you want to keep it super small, super minimal, I always add the README file already when I create it with GitHub. And then there is this other little useful tool, which is add a .gitignore file. And I mean, this is potentially a bit more advanced for now, but since you are offered here, I will just briefly mention what this does. This is a small file that we put in a repository that tells Git to ignore some kind of files. So if we know for sure from scratch that, like from the beginning of a project, we know that from time to time we might be saving even accidentally some, I don't know, CSV files in the repository that are just, they come from our scripts, but we don't really want to keep track of them because, I don't know, they're very heavy and they would make the code very messy. We can add in the gitme file, the gitignore file, we can tell GitHub to ignore all files that are CSV, and this will not keep track of them. Okay.
What do you mean by not keeping track of them? You mean like not keeping the history or not just keeping the last saved version?
No, you can put the file there. Like if we decide to ignore CSV files, on your computer you can put there a CSV file. It won't complain about the fact that there is a file. But every time you commit, you're not actually committing that file. And if you push, you're not pushing that file. And if you move your code to another machine, you will not see that file. And the good thing about gitignore is there are always, like sometimes, for example, for notebooks, you might have noticed that Jupyter notebooks automatically save a bunch of crap in a .jupyter .ipynb, something like that folder that are kind of checkpoints, like internal checkpoints of Jupyter notebooks. And there are many tools that we use to work with Python that might create something like that. And that's just things that would end up in our folder, but we know already that if we are using Python, those files are not stuff that are useful for us. And the good thing about this gitignore is that there is a bunch of pre-compiled gitignore files that we can already choose from without having to write one ourselves. We can modify it if we want, but we can just say add gitignore Python, and this already puts a gitignore file that is reasonable if we work with Python. And I mean, a license, which is important if you make a project and you want to share it with the community, but in our case is not important, so I will not add it. And we can just create the repository. And it will think about it for a while, and then hopefully just bring us to our new repository page. Everyone managed to create a repository? Cool. Someone wants to wait more until I... Okay, just stop me if you are losing us. Okay, so in the repository page, let's just spend a minute and see what we get here. So in this main window, we will see all the files that are contained, files and folders that are contained in our repository, which for the moment are just the gitignore file, which we decided to add, and the readme.md file. and the README file is actually also what is displayed here automatically. Okay. So there are a bunch of other things. If we have time, we probably might look a bit more into them at the end. But for now, let's just stick to the bare minimum, and let's just now go on our local version control application, so on our computer, and let's just make a copy of this new repository on our computer so that we can start adding files to this. Okay. So I just install GitHub desktop so I can start from scratch with you guys. So it asks for an authorization. I'm just signing it with my credentials. I'm just using all the defaults. So it just goes online, does the authentication online. Okay. It was just asking to move the app to the application folder, which I agreed on. I cannot authorize. Let's try again. Okay. So there should be the option to clone a repository from the internet. And that's where we want to go if we want to start cloning locally the repository we just created. Still not working for me. Yeah, but it's not. This is kind of blocked. Shoot. Okay. Let me briefly restart my system because there's something going. There's something going on. Okay, so let's try to open it again. Okay, great. I also have it. So in my case, it should have been cloned to Vigi, GitHub. No documents, GitHub, and here's my repo. feel free to change the location from the default one. Usually, since many times you have those path things, a general recommendation for where you keep your code is to just something simple like user/code, and you have there all your repository. That's what I normally do. It's convenient to keep the path short, just for you to know. So that's why usually I don't keep stuff in documents, GitHub. Okay, but yes, we can find our repository in our file system. We can see that there is this CIMeC repo test. We have the readme.md file, which you won't be surprised is just a txt file, which we can potentially open with any text file editor or more advanced software development tool. We have the gitignore file, which is also just a txt file named in a funny way. We can actually just have a look for curiosity at how it looks like. And we see that there are a bunch of lines that specify basically file extensions and things that is probably not good to commit. For example, you will find the notebook things that I was mentioning. See like ipynb.checkpoints, which is what is saved by default by Jupyter Lab, like stuff like that. And we also have the .git folder, which is what I mentioned earlier. It's just reassuring to know that it's there, but you will never have to actually look inside, so don't worry. Good. Okay, so now that we actually have our local repository, let me run the lecture again. We can actually start and put some content in it. So you can, for example, just create a simple .py file with a stupid line of code defining it, like print hello world, and just put it in the repository. Okay, so we have one first change that we want to start keeping track of in the repository. So with whatever, like you can do it with Jupyter Notebook, you can do it with the Notepad, just do whatever editing tool that you want to create a new .py file inside the repository so that we have something that we can commit. Okay, do we have our file? So once we have it, we can actually go to the GitHub desktop interface. Okay, and we will see that in the little window we have changes panel, where like we will see something that has the name of the py file that we just created, and this is basically like with this symbol that stands for, let's say, is that this is a new file that was not there before, and we are creating it. We can actually also do something else. For example, we can modify the README file that was already there just to see if it looks differently. So I can just add a new line changed locally. Okay. And now, if we go here, we actually see that there is another change that GitHub Desktop has detected, which is, oh, we also changed the README file. We added those lines. Okay. So we actually have two changes, and let's say that we are now happy and we want to commit them to take a snapshot of the current state of the repository after we edited this file. Okay. To commit, we want to change, like to add, is called the description, like a small summary of what we did. Like every time we commit, we have to write a small string, can be super short, that just somehow describes what we just did to our code. It's useful to, like, it's good to keep small, to make small commits, also to make those messages more informative, because if we have been working for 2 weeks and all of a sudden we remember we are making a commit, there is no way we can fit a reasonable summary here. Let's just say added dot test file dot by. This is good. Okay. And I can just say commit to main, and that's it. So now if we go and see the history bar, okay, in the history bar we will see a chronology of all the commits that were made in that repository. Now there's only 2. There is like the creation of the commit basically, and this first commit that I made. Okay, there could be more. Usually a project has hundreds of commits, and we would see them listed in this panel. Okay, and now what we can do is, like, the final thing that we want to, operation that we want to do to, let's say, keep our code safe, is we want to push the commit that we just made to the remote location to make sure that we also update the remote repository that we have for this project. Okay, and for this we have to press here push origin. Obviously we can do it only if we are online, and after we do this we can refresh the page online, and we should be able to see that now the new file was added to the repository on GitHub. Everyone managed to? Let's wait some more. Okay, so I want to stress the fact that if you don't commit, even if you push, nothing is pushed. So what is pushed is not I move a file there and I push and the file will be put online, because it's not files that we are putting online, it's commits. Okay, it's those snapshots that you are taking of the repository.
But like, what is the meaning of committing and not pushing?
So we can, for example, in our case, as far as we are concerned, it doesn't matter. Like, you can potentially push every time you commit. It doesn't really matter. It can start matter if you are working on the same thing with someone else. If I don't know, if you might want to make a bunch of commits before synchronizing your version with whatever someone else might have been putting online. In that case, it might be a good thing to have a bunch of local commits and not pushing them automatically every time you commit. Okay. But otherwise, many times there is a single button that says like commit and push. That's depending on the tool that you use, can happen. And the other thing is, we potentially can also, I don't know, I will just create to add more files. I just made other 2 copies of this file, okay, 3 copies. Let's say that I am happy with the changes that I made to 2 of those files, but not to the changes that I made to the 3rd file. If you look here on the side, you can toggle and untoggle what you are actually committing. So you can also decide that you do not want to commit all the files, but only the changes to some of the files. You can potentially do it by selecting those things. Also make sure that everything that you want to commit, like usually by default, everything that you changed is selected, but make sure that everything is selected, because only what is selected is actually committed by this interface. Okay, so select all the changes that you want to select. Okay, and the moment you, like, if I have, like, now I have not committed, and let's say that I change my mind and I remove all those files. If I go back here, those are gone forever. Okay, if I now I know what I was doing, but if I was changing something else, and I lost those files, if I have not committed them, they are lost. Okay, so make sure that you commit every time you want to save your files.
They are lost, like they are not even in my local folder anymore.
If you have not committed, no. Like
So
in this
like
case,
it's the same as doing like the punch from the folder.
no, now I actually made like I created some files and I deleted them from the folder.
Ah,
Okay,
from the
just to
folder.
show that if you remove the files and if you have not committed in the
But if you commit, don't push, and delete the files, you still have the copy.
yes, then the deletion is itself a modification. Okay, so if I now delete this test file, now I will see that okay, the change that I can keep track of is I remove this file from the repository. Okay, if I commit now this, the online version will lose the file, but in the history I also I have the commit where this file was there, so I can revert to that version. Okay, so that's why we actually don't need to make any copy of our file with different numbers, as long as we write informative messages which allow us, like, why do we need the messages? Because then we go here and in the list we actually, what we see here in the titles are the commit messages that we were typing. So if we actually want to go back to a place where we know that we changed something that might have broke whatever code that we are working on, we can trace it back using those commit messages. Yeah, no, there are also like we can do all of this with this GitHub desktop interface. We can also, if we want to do everything with the terminal, there are commands for doing all of this. We can say Git, and Git is a command line software tool as the ones that we were like as Conda, for example. And that, yeah, we would have to go to the folder where we have the project. So we have desktop, we have not desktop, documents, GitHub, we have CIMeC repo test. So I can say git add to add some files to commit. I can say git commit, and I can type a message. And I can say, well, in this case, I have no changes. And I can just say,
Can you zoom in?
oh, sure, sorry. Remind me. Okay, so to add the whole content of the repository, so from the interface, we automatically have all those things that are kind of toggled. Okay, the command line equivalent of toggling on and off files is to say git add. So git add will basically create this list of changes that we are about to commit. And to change them all, we can just say dot for basically commit the whole folder. And we can say git commit, and we can say commit from the command line interface, and we can say git push. Yeah, this will ask me for my username and password. Which are apparently expired just today. So if you, let's try. Okay, so the annoying thing of doing it from the terminal, well, it's annoying once a year, and apparently decided to be today. You have to create a token for the authenticate, like it's just a fancy way of authentifying. It suggests a page where you can get instructions on where to do it, but basically you have to, from your settings and developer settings, you can feel very proud because now you're looking into developer settings. And you can say personal access tokens, and you have to generate a new token. And this token is basically a little like string that you can, that GitHub, that the interface saves somewhere on your computer, from which I will say not expiration now. MacBook. And you can, yeah, you can specify what this token has authorization to do. I will just select a bunch of things, and we can say generate token. And now we want to copy this token and use this as the password. And now this was fine. Okay. You have to do it the first time you set it up, and then it won't ask for it again until your token expires, as it did now. But you can just stick to the, like, this is entirely equivalent to the graphic interface, okay? Sometimes if you just have to add, commit, and pull and push, you can do it from the terminal if you have a terminal open. It's much easier to, for example, see the past history from the graphic interface. So with GitHub, I generally recommend also using some an interface. And notice that many times the tool, like if you use VS Code or PyCharm as the editor tools for your code, many times they might have already embedded in them tools for like version control systems. And from here you can actually, basically from those programs, you can automatically pull and push without having to go to the graphic, like to the GitHub desktop graphic interface. This is just to say that you can do those operations, like the basic operations are always the same, like the concept is the same, but you can operate this from multiple places, from the interface, from the terminal, from the whatever editor you're using for your code. Yes?
Does it work also with MATLAB?
So I don't know. I think that MATLAB has some version control integration.
Okay.
But I think it added after the last time I opened MATLAB. So I actually, I never used it. But like, there's nothing obviously, like whatever we are talking about today, there's nothing Python specific, right? Like the code that we put here and we version control could be MATLAB code, could be R code. It can be any type of code, okay? The only thing that I will actually mention that is important, I might have a slide on this now. It is important that you just use, you just commit code, okay? Why? Because if you commit something in a repository, that thing is there forever. So if you commit 500 megabytes of data that was in your repository by mistake, if it's the last, if you realize in time and it's the last commit, there might be super painful ways around it, but like it's super sticky. GitHub, like Git is super sticky and it's very difficult to take that thing out. And you can imagine that if you want the possibility to always go back to the state where the repository had 500 megabytes of data in it, that means that your repository is at least 500 megabytes. And this is fine if you do it once, because 500 megabytes is still something manageable. But if you start doing it multiple times, it can quickly become, like, I think the limit for a GitHub repository is something around 2 gigabytes, I think. So, and then like copying it locally becomes super long. Like you don't want to have heavy repositories. So if there are super specific situations where you know that you want to put, like, you need a small piece of example data together with your code for whatever reason, for a demonstration, for a demo, whatever. I was doing this with small data for the codes repository. You can do it as long as like you are aware of the fact that you're putting there data, and if you are changing those data for whatever reason, you're accumulating space with every change. Okay, because if you are changing a TXT file where changing can be mapped as the user removed this line and added these other 5 lines, we are not creating a copy. But if you are saving there on a movie and you are cropping the movie and reshaping it and doing whatever, GitHub will just save a new file. If it's not TXT files, it does not know how to store them efficiently. Okay, so as a general rule, never put data in a GitHub repository. If you think it might happen to you by mistake to put data there, you can make sure that nothing ever gets committed by editing the gitignore file, okay? So
What if we want to use GitHub as some people do for open science purposes?
So I do not recommend GitHub for GitHub is quite limited in terms of space for the data. Like there's better places for data compared to GitHub. Okay, so there is a list in the slides on sharing code, sharing data together with code. But like GitHub is good for software, but I would not recommend it for data. It's not for software. It's for everything that is like text. Okay, so it's also great if you want to keep notes in somewhere. Like for example, there's people who keep all their notes on GitHub because like you can do exactly the same operations if you write notes in a text editor of any kind. Okay. Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to show is we can imagine that sometimes like we have our local version of the computer for this project, but for example, we can imagine that we might have, for example, done some changes to the repository from another computer, okay? So, and we have pushed them from another computer, and so now we want to update our local file to be at the same state of the last commit that was put on GitHub from, for example, another computer, okay? So to simulate this scenario, we can, well, it does not have to be another computer, another place where we can edit files from, and sometimes it's useful. We can also directly edit files on GitHub, okay? So for example, the README file, we can edit online just from the browser. There is this little pen here. So we can go here and we can edit the README file. This is a markdown file, which is the same syntax that you would use to write the comment cells in the notebook. So this is a title, and we can say, I am adding a new line from the browser. Okay. And if we edit the file in GitHub, there is no save button. There is a commit button to remind us that we are not saving, we are committing changes. So we can commit changes. It has a default message that is update and name of the file, but we can just keep that one. We can commit. Okay. So this means now that in the remote place, so on GitHub, there are changes that I still do not have locally on my computer. Okay. And this means that if I now start working and I will try to push, I won't be able to push because my local version was not updated with the last remote version, okay? So the first thing that I need to do is fetching and pulling. So fetching basically means, okay, just check out what happened online. Check out if something happened online. And I asked to fetch, and now it is actually telling me, look, there is one thing that you can pull. So there is one thing online that was changed that you might want to to update locally before keep working on this project. Okay. And so we can press pull. Like sometimes you have to fetch. Sometimes the fetching is automatic, and it will just say pull if there are changes. And after we have pressed the pull button, we can actually see that now there are 4 commits, and the 4th one is the update readme.md commit that I just did online. Okay. So usually this, as long as you're just working on a machine, on a single machine, and you're using GitHub to just, you're working alone on a project, there's no one else apart from you making changes to that code, usually you just push from one place, and is not so common to pull remote code, okay? This becomes very important if you are working from multiple computers, if you are working with other people that might have changed the same code that you are working on, okay? In those cases, pooling is more important. Because you can also imagine that there might be conflicts between like changes that someone did, like last changes that someone did on the remote, and changes that you made locally on your file. In which case, when there's conflicts, how easy it is to fixing them is actually up to your whatever like GitHub tool that you're using. Like I never use GitHub Desktop. The one that I use as a merge tool where you see the changes that you did, the changes that the other person did, and you can choose whether to keep your version or the other person version for all the changes. But we can actually try it now. So let's imagine that I am a local user and I make some changes to the readme.md file, and I write another line from the local repo, and I save this file and I commit it. That's a local change. I commit, but I do not push, okay? And now remotely I'm still seeing the old version because I have not pushed from the local version. So I can add it and I can say new line from the browser. Commit changes. Okay. So if I now try to push, it will complain, and like this is actually something that you cannot do. Like you can try it and it will just block you, because if in the remote version there are new changes that you have not synchronized locally yet, you cannot push until you have somehow fixed the potential problems that might have arisen from the double editing. Okay, so I can say fetch to actually see the remote changes, and I can say pull, and now it actually says, okay, so what it did is it is telling me that there was one conflict, and it is suggesting me to open, so there was one file that was edited from two places, okay? And what this tool does, and different tools might solve this differently. This is a very, like if you're working just by yourself, like this is a problem if you're working with other people. If you're working just by yourself, this is something that will never happen. I'm just mentioning it because it might be scary the first time it happens. This is just telling me to open the file where there are conflicts from a text editor. And this is just say, okay, there was a change that looked like this from the local version, but there was this alternative line from the remote. Do something about it, and commit whatever you have decided to keep. So let's say that I actually want to keep the line from the browser. I can delete everything. This is just a normal text editor, like nothing fancy. Just added to the text file those lines that are telling me where the conflict was. Okay, so I can just save it, and I can say now there's no conflicts remaining. It is happy, and I can say continue merge, and this says merge means that like the conflict has been solved, and there is now again only one version. Okay, the two different conflicting versions have been reunified to only one version. But yeah, this was just for completeness. If you're just working by yourself from one computer, like this obviously can also arise if you change stuff from a computer and then you go on another computer and you change the same thing in a different way. and you have two versions that are different. But if you don't have any of those scenarios at hand, this will not really be an issue. Okay. Okay, good. I think that was pretty much everything that I wanted to show for the sake of what you will actually need for submitting your project, because like you will just need to create a new repository. You will need to edit, like clone it, and do whatever like the development that you are doing for that project. You should keep it there. Remember to commit. If you make it public, people will see all your commits, like not just the state of the repository, but also the list of all the commits. And if you share it with me, I will see of all the commits, so I can actually also go look into how many times you were committing your project. But yeah, keep track of it by committing often. And yeah, super strong recommendation. Really try to implement this for all the code that you're doing for your science business, okay? Because this is really the one way to make sure that you never lose code, that you always keep track of everything that you're changing, that you have a very simple way of sharing it with other people. Like, it's super convenient. It can be a bit cumbersome at the beginning because you have to get used to this new system, I can understand, but it's really, really convenient. And it actually becomes vital, a bit more complicated to use, but vital the moment you're working, this I had here, the moment you're working with, well, there is one feature that may be useful even if you're just developing stuff by yourself, which I will mention. If you're curious, you can check it out. I will not try to go through it in the lecture, but you can make branches from your repository. So let's imagine that you have an idea of something that you want to change, but that would break half of your analysis, so you don't want to start changing it until you're sure that everything can be refactored in a nice way. You can create a branch. So this means this will literally fork your project in a separate timeline, and you can make a new bunch of commit snapshots in this new branch, branch from literally, imagine a tree of commits. As long as you have only one branch, there's just one commit after the other. But then you can branch it, and you can have a new branch where you put a new list of commits, which are completely independent from the main branch. So if you now want to go back and forget about all the changes that you did and just keep working on another script, you can go back to the main branch and keep working there, and then go back to your refactoring in the other branch. And those things are completely separated until, if you want, you decide to merge them again. Okay? So this is a very convenient way if you're working, for example, on new features that might impact your code. You can use those branches. And the other thing that GitHub can be very useful with is if you're working with other people on the same code. And again, we will not be looking at this now in the lecture because it's a bit more of an advanced feature, but you can, there's plenty of tutorials online. The idea is I can be the owner of a repository, and there's people who might want to contribute stuff to my code. Okay, they can create their version of my repository in GitHub. They can there is a button, you can see it over here. If you go on someone else's code, I don't know, I can look in the NumPy repository, and I want to make my own version of NumPy because I'm super cocky. I can say fork. Okay, fork will create a new, basically a copy of this repository in my own GitHub account. So I will have my account is Vigi. I will have a Vigi/NumPy repository that is identical to this repository the moment I forked it. Okay, and where I can pull all the changes that people are making to the main one. But which I entirely own, so I can change whatever I want in that repository, and no one NumPy core developers will actually care about what I'm doing with that code because I forked it and is completely independent from the original one. But then let's imagine that I found a bug and I fix it. From my version, I can make a so-called pull request to the main code saying, okay guys, look, there is this script where you have this little bug and I make this fix. And obviously I cannot just pull it there, like I cannot just push on this repository, like this is a repository where only the developers of NumPy can push stuff, but I can make a pull request. The name is super, I never understood why they call it that way. It should be like a push request. It makes no sense to me. But I can make a pull request and people can look at it. There is all sort of like any kind of serious open source organization has their own internal rules for reviewing those requests. And they review it, and if they like it, they can actually eventually merge it to the main branch. Okay, and this system of pull requests is basically super common for people developing open software around. Okay, so the idea is you have some owners of a repository, and there's people outside that repository that might want to contribute code. And they do it through pull requests because they obviously cannot directly write that code, but they still want to change that code in the one place that matters, because if I fix the bug in NumPy in my own repository, it will work for me, but no one else in the world will ever know that I have that fork for NumPy. Okay, what actually matters for the world is this official NumPy repository. Okay. And just for you to close the circle and to know why this is the case is because the people who own this repository are the people who actually went on PyPy. If you remember the database where you pip install things from, and they register the trademark NumPy. Okay, so the NumPy library that is pip installed every time you pip install NumPy is the library that is on that PyPy database. And in that PyPy database, they registered it from this repository. So this is the only place that matters as long as NumPy is concerned. Yeah, this was a bit of kind of sociology of the open software infrastructure. Yeah, so strongly recommended if you're working on yourself. Keep your stuff on GitHub. If you're working with other people, consider setting up a repository, a shared repository where each one of you can work. You can also make for your lab, if you have code that many people can be using, a common thing to do in the same, like within a lab is you can create an organization. It's very easy and free. You can just say new organization. And so at that point, you can create folders that are organization folder. Like, I don't know, we have at the UReally lab, we have a bunch of UReally lab folders. So every time I am developing code for the lab, I actually do not create the repository from my own user. I create it from the lab user. So when you create a new repository here, you can specify the owner. And you can say that the owner is not you, but is like your lab organization. And in that way, everyone in the lab automatically gets access to this without you having to add them manually. And you can keep things private, but public within the lab. Okay, so this is what I would recommend for lab code. Yeah, and speaking of this, like moving to more sciencey kind of code, I wanted to have one last part of the lecture, which won't be very practical, but just to talk a bit more about the kind of some important things to keep track of if you are planning to at some point publish code of any kind. And we can in general think of like two different occurrences where you might want to publish some code. So one case is you have developed a new super fancy tool that you think might be useful to other people. And so you actually want to, I don't know, make a library and make it public and let the world see and use the software that you just made, which can be like, you should consider it. But there is another occurrence, which is you should also just publish the code that you have written for a paper that you are about to publish. Okay, in which case, like this is a complete different mentality, but it's still a kind of situation where you might want to publish code. We will actually not be talking about the first occurrence because, like, before start developing tools that you want to offer to users, you have to be very considerate of many things that would fill a whole course by themselves. But you should actually always consider the second point. My very strong recommendation is to try to if you have a paper where there is not necessarily a large significant fraction of code, but even a small amount of code involved, I would always strongly recommend to publish the code. And that's basically because the code that you might publish with a paper is by far the most readable method section that you might ever write. Not obviously for all experiments, but for all the parts that require, all the, let's say, analysis part of the materials and methods could potentially, and hopefully at some point in the future will potentially completely be overthrown by just publishing your code where that analysis is happening. Okay, there's nothing more explicit than the actual code that is producing the figures going from the experimental part, experimental raw data. It is actually, many times, it's also a great way to describe the experiment that you're running, because you can be as thorough as you want in the description of, I don't know, a psychophysics task, but the best way of actually describing it is if you are writing the code to run the psychophysics task, is actually just share the code for the psychophysics task itself. So I can literally take that code and run the experiment on my own. Okay. And also, if we start from the beginning, thinking about the fact that eventually we will be publishing the code that we are using for a paper, this forces us to kind of be a bit more tidy in the way we think about that analysis. And it forces us to, for example, think about, okay, what are the things where there has to be some human judgment, the annotation that a person has to do? What are the parts that I'm doing but potentially could be dispensable? Can I automatize as much as possible of this process so that another person could potentially reproduce it just by running code? So it forces us a bit of not just keeping track of what we did in an abstract way. Okay, I'm writing on my notebook that I extracted the ROI data using this software, and I saved this in this folder with this structure, and then I'm reading it with other software, and I'm manually pasting the files from this place to this other, and then I'm opening everything with this whatever other software. And if I want to be thorough, I have to write all those steps one by one in some logbook that I'm keeping. If instead I'm doing those things programmatically, the best description of the things is, okay, I just have this bunch of code that does this. And even if it's the messier code that you can think of, it is still very important. There is, this only this occurrence were not publish the code that you are working on. Mostly people don't publish the code either because they are not in an environment where they have been suggested to do so, but actually the highest barrier is the feeling that you might have to put there a lot of work to publish your code, or that even if you put a ton of work, your code will be ugly, and you are ashamed of putting out ugly code. But this is actually not true in the sense that you don't have to publish perfect code, okay? And ugly code is still way better than no code for a paper. And I think an increasing number of people that are used to this idea of publishing code, you can always imagine that your reader, if sees no code in the paper, start from assuming that the code is ugly, because if it was beautiful code, they would have published it. So better to just put it out there, And it might be difficult to understand, might be difficult to read, but at least is a kind of deterministic track of whatever you were doing for that paper. And obviously, you should not just put it, like, you can try to make it a bit better, but like, it does not have to be perfect code that like only a Python developer would write, or like R Pro would write. Ugly code is way better than no code. And yeah, so let's say that I convince you and you are you are good to go with publishing the code that you're writing for analysis. So what are the requirements that should be there? So for example, a good starting point is to have a repository where you want to put your code, and this we just figure out. So if you start from school, like from the beginning, working in a repository, that's actually good. One less step to go. You should always have the README file that we just saw, that automatically comes with repository, okay? And in the README, if you're actually putting your code out there, you should make sure that you write a little bit of, well, like, it does not have to be like a novel, but at least some detail of what is in the repository, like, if it's associated with a paper, what is the paper that this is associated with, which figures of the paper this is, like which parts of the analysis of the paper this is replicating, which kind of data. You can point out which are the scripts where, for example, I don't know, the most, like you can imagine, and you don't have to, like, you can, like just thinking about it, you can figure it out. You can imagine that there are parts of your project that are probably not super, like it's good to have there, but are not super relevant. I don't know, if you're using a pipeline that is super common in the community and everyone already knows, basically everyone do it in the same, that part in the same way, that's not super relevant. Or if you have a part of the code that is just changing names and creating path, that's probably not super important. While you have some parts where, I don't know, you are computing the key statistics of your paper, you are generating the key figures, those are probably parts that is worth highlighting and in this README file, and say, okay, this part is important because like this part has that figure, like does not have to be like figure 1A is figure 1B is for every single figure, but just broadly where it is stuff to replicate what. And yeah, obviously should have been even earlier. But yeah, you can have you should also write the software requirements for running the scripts, like if it was R, MATLAB, Python, which version, which modules you were using. Okay. There was something that is probably a license. Sorry. No. As we mentioned, yeah, a license is very important. So if you want, like, not very important, if you don't envision your code to be kind of used by a company that you don't want to use your code, but still, like, it's good to, like, the moment you put something public, it's good to have a license, just as a matter of principle. You can choose a random one if you don't really care, but just choose one. The one super important thing that you should have if you're publishing code is to make sure that the code, that when you share code, you share it using a DOI, okay? DOIs, probably you know them from papers, are digital object identifiers. They are basically sequences, they are URLs, some number of text and numbers that if you put in an URL that is like doi.org/your whatever DOI code, this brings you to wherever online your stuff is stored, okay? Digital object identifiers are basically the only way to ensure that something that that a link that you are giving to someone will work in the future for at least some number of years. Okay, that's why DOIs are important, and that's why journals release DOIs. This is basically the basics of online publishing. Is I cannot put stuff somewhere in a website where at some point that material can disappear and use that link in a paper, because people reading that paper in 3 years will not find that stuff online anymore. And since everything in the internet is pretty volatile, people came out with the idea of digital object identifiers, where basically there is, just for you to know how it works, there is a consortium, like an organization, I don't know who formed it, but is kind of those certification systems, like the DOI organization certifies some websites, given some requirement, like they have to satisfy some requirements, their servers have to be functional for some amount of time, like should not be, they should not be down for maintenance more than, I don't know, 1% of the time. They have to ensure that whatever you are putting there will stay for, I think the minimum requirement for UIs is 10 years, okay? And at that point, like whenever a website is authorized for releasing, the term is minting DOIs, we can get the DOI and ensure the DOI instead of the whatever leak. And GitHub actually does not mint DOIs. So if you publish your code, you should never publish code directly, like you should never put on GitHub code associated with a paper and just give the GitHub link, because after you publish the paper, you might decide to, or like another person or whatever happens, and you accidentally delete the repository, change the status from private from public to private. Anything can happen to a GitHub repository. A GitHub repository is not a DOI, so you should not share the GitHub link, okay? In some situations, like, I don't know, you want to, like you are presenting a tool that will be developed online by a community that is developing the tool on GitHub. In that case, it makes sense to put the GitHub link. But if you want to just put in a paper something and make sure that that is permanent, do not rely on GitHub. There's actually specialized servers that give you, like, basically once you register there, they're free, they're maintained by some science-related foundation, organization. And once you logged in and you sync them with your GitHub repository, there is basically a button with which you can directly create a make a copy of the GitHub repository in that place and get a DOI for that copy. Okay, so Zenodo is something like that. Figshare is also something like that. And at that point, you can use, and you should use that DOI that those two minted for publishing your code, like to give to the editor to put in the code availability section. And yeah, obviously also publishing data is important to have that code to run on something. Publishing data can be slightly trickier because you enter the issue of size that we were just mentioning. If your data is just even a large, but a bunch of CSV files that like overall is in the order of, I don't know, some tens of megabytes, you can still think of putting it on GitHub, and that's perfectly fine. But otherwise, there are actually also other places that are that give you a DOI, but allow you to put a significant amount of data up there. And yeah, and so those places are like what I mentioned. Figshare and Zenodo allow you to upload something like in the order of, I think, 100 or 200 gigabytes, which is, I mean, is enough for some things, not necessarily enough for everything. You can look into options for bigger things. There is this Dandy archive. There is this Open Neuro, which is probably more used in the community of imaging. Yeah, I don't know, is there a maximum there for size? I don't know, but like those are places where you can load a lot of data and you still have a minted DOI. And yeah, so same thing that I was saying with the code. If you want to share your data, make sure that you share it with the DOI, and it's not that you uploaded a bunch of data on Google Drive and you share the link. Okay, so digital object identifiers are the proper way of making sure that your code will remain available. And yeah, if you are publishing your code, even if you are not for example, if for, I don't know, space reasons you are not managing to put the raw data, my suggestion is to still try to put pre-processed data if you can have that at a reasonable size. And maybe you can have a small kind of toy data set for the heavy part where you just put a small amount of data that is still enough to reproduce. I don't know, I can imagine an imaging pipeline where you won't upload the raw data. You might have some, I don't know, signal extraction that compress the information to, I don't know, the signal from some of the ROIs, and you can publish that signal. But you can also, for example, take a small crop of your data set just to showcase how your pipeline for extraction was working. I mean, you don't have to do it. This is more elaborate, but this is potentially somewhere useful. And obviously, if you publish your data in code, make sure that wherever you're publishing your data, you mention where your code is published and vice versa. So one person can find the other piece. Good. Okay. Yeah, there was no practicals today. We finished early. I think I'm done with everything that I wanted to say.